Okay, we are winding down with this class. This is our second to the last, and we're on track to be able to finish. But I want to make good time today so that I don't end up having to take you past 10:45 to finish my class, next Sunday. So where we've gotten so far is we have looked at what our options were, using the method of logic to test worldviews. We've considered the 6 plausible worldviews for people in the 21st century. Worldviews that, people that know about science and what scholarship has discovered, and philosophy and so forth, and religion. These are worldviews people would consider. And using the test of logical consistency, both internally and externally, both within the philosophical system itself, as well as with what it says about the world and whether it is consistent with the world, we've basically eliminated, polytheism, the belief in many gods; naturalism, the belief that nature is all that it is, both the atheistic version of that and the pantheistic version of that, which says that God is everything. We've seen none of these are logically coherent. We also looked at a newer worldview that's gained currency called panentheism, that God and the world are related, like I'm related to my body. The world is a part of God, but not the whole story. God is a personal being. We've seen that also is inadequate as a worldview. And then that narrowed us down to basically that our only option left is that God is infinite, personal, transcendent, and holy, or moral. And within that framework, you've got 2 options. Either God is all that, but he never established a relationship with the world, or he is all that, and he has established a relationship with the world. So last week we looked at option A, and that's called Deism. That's the 5th worldview. God created the world, but then withdrew from it and has had nothing to do with it ever since. And we saw that it has 3 basic problems. One is the problem that it is emotionally unsatisfying. Now that doesn't disprove it, but it gives us good reason to want to make sure about it, because we don't want to embrace something that ultimately is not going to satisfy us. And it's not going to satisfy us because what are we seeking in this class? We're seeking a connection with our source. We're seeking, if it's possible, to have a relationship with God. And this will not offer that. Deism does not offer that. But it's also logically unsatisfying, because why would a God who is personal create personal beings and then not desire a personal relationship with them? Part of being personal is being relational. Why would God create us but then not seek out a relationship with us? And then finally, the major proof against deism is it doesn't correspond with the external world. In other words, it makes a claim that God has not had anything to do with the world, and yet there is historic evidence that God has had something to do with the world. And so that is what leads us into theism. And this is, for me, as a seeker of truth, as someone who was hoping to find my purpose for existence, this was the most unbelievably exciting and life-changing discovery that I made. And I made it not because of my own piercing intellect, but because God had mercy and came to me and revealed himself to me through the preaching of the gospel at a time in my life, as you remember my testimony, that was critical. He had mercy to come to me and reveal himself to me in a way that I couldn't deny it, just following my own rules for seeking the truth. And as I began to study the Bible, what I found is ample evidence that this really is a revelation from God. And that is what's so exciting, is that God really has made himself known. He really has spoken to man and given us the answers to the big questions. And so there is a purpose to life. And so let's just look at that, because what I pointed out last week is as you look at the historical evidence to see whether or not God has made himself known, the truth of the matter is you can look in every other direction besides the biblical tradition, the biblical history, and you will find no evidence that that has happened. That's very significant. If you look at Confucianism, you'll find that Confucius basically was a pragmatist, and he came up with an ethical system to structure society by, ethical teachings. If you look at Buddhism, you'll see that Buddha was someone who was seeking an answer to the suffering of life, and he was sitting under the Bodhi tree, and all of a sudden he had this realization, this enlightenment, that all suffering is caused by desire. And so out of that, he came up with his Four Noble Truths and his Eightfold Path in order to eliminate suffering from human lives. Again, this was not God reaching down to Buddha and revealing anything to him. This was Buddha having a realization on his own, clearing his mind and supposedly then seeing some truth. As you look at the basic indigenous religions that are found throughout the world, known as animism or just basic primitive, pre-literate religions that have many things in common throughout them, you will again not find any instance of God coming and revealing himself. You will find instead a lot of myths that tell creation stories, or that try to give some kind of purpose to life or some kind of structure for society or for these pre-literate societies to live by. You'll find very superstitious beliefs that are not plausible to people in the 21st century, about how various items in nature are inhabited by souls, and just fantastic stories about how the world got to be, and none of that is plausible, and none of that speaks of revelation. So as you survey all of human history, it's very significant that there's only one tradition that makes the claim that it was initiated not by human effort, but by God stepping into human affairs to make himself known. Now let's try the black glasses here, see how they work. Let's look now. We have finally come to the Bible in this class, and we're not going to be departing from it from here on, okay? We've used logic to get to where we are right now, but logically, it's necessary to consult the Bible. And once we do consult the Bible, we find ample evidence that it is inspired by God, and so it then becomes logical to refer truth questions to the Bible. And so at this point, if you've got your outlines, you're going to want to look at major options within theism, Roman numeral 2, capital letter A. This is on page 3. Judaism. If you don't have your outlines, there are outlines on the table there. And as we look at Judaism, we have these three major options within theism. One is Judaism, the other is Christianity, and the other is Islam. And so is Judaism, or was it as originally founded, the revelation of God? Do we see God actually intervening in human history in Judaism? Well, we start out in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. And up until this point in the Bible, we have a history being told. It is the history of creation. You know, Genesis chapter 1, and this is what you would expect from a revelation of God, okay? It's not just going to start in the middle of some cultural phenomenon at a particular point of history with a narrow focus on a particular culture. If it's a revelation of God, you would hope that it's going to give you the big picture. It's going to start out at the beginning, and by that I mean the real beginning of the creation itself, which is exactly what Genesis does. And of course, the whole 66 books of the Bible take you through all the way to the consummation in Revelation chapter 22, the final state of things in the new heaven and the new earth and the new Jerusalem, with the people of God entering into their reward and living for eternity worshiping God. So from that standpoint, as something that claims to be a revelation of God, the Bible is living up to what you would expect in terms of not simply being a provincial record of one culture's affairs. Rather, it starts out with the big picture in Genesis chapter 1, the creation of the heaven and the earth, and it goes through, not in scientific terms for a non-scientific people, but neither in terms that are fantastic, mythological, but in terms that are consistent with modern science, and simply tells about how God first created the raw stuff of creation and then created increasing differentiation within it, increasing complexity, increasingly sophisticated creations, culminating on the sixth day of creation with the creation of man in his own image. Then we have the historical account of how he placed them in the Garden of Eden, and man named the animals, and Eve was created, and marriage is instituted, and so forth. But a moral test was presented, which was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they were commanded not to partake of this tree, lest they die, which of course we know they did. So we have the record of the fall, all right? So as a revelation of God, it's also supplying the major question of what is wrong with humanity? Why don't we know God? Why is there so much evil in the world? Why is there death? Why are there all these things that we wouldn't have expected from a good God to create and establish within a world? Well, a very profound answer is given, and that is that we are moral creatures, moral agents, and there are choices that we have to make that have consequences. And so we see then that in the Garden of Eden, that whole basic issue is completely addressed. So we have the record of the fall, and that therefore we have this historic information that you couldn't just get from reason or from looking at nature, which is what Deism does, that explains what the root of the problem is. It's sin. And because of sin, things aren't the way that God originally intended them to be. And so and it's a radical problem. It results in death, and the whole human race, the Bible records, is caught up in this problem. And so it's a problem that needs to be resolved. And so the world is not the way it was originally intended to be. There's something that is wrong with it, and it would make sense that God would go about rectifying that which is wrong. And that's what the whole Bible records, is God's activity to do exactly that. Okay, so with that then you have a history of early humanity, and what you see is a pattern that Paul describes well in Romans chapter 1. That man in his sinfulness tends to extinguish from his own consciousness the knowledge of God, so that men and women, human beings, can live out their own sinful desires without the convicting and piercing light of God's presence, condemning them for their sins. So there is a tendency then, because of our own wantonness, rebelliousness, evil tendencies, wicked hearts, which is how all terms the Bible uses to describe the natural man. There is a tendency where you start out with the knowledge of God, but thinking yourself to be wise, Paul says in Romans chapter 1, you become a fool and you worship and serve the creation rather than the Creator. And Jesus describes the same process in John chapter 3, how people love the darkness rather than the light because their deeds are evil. And so we have that tendency. So what we see as we look at the early history of man, we see that by the time of Noah, nobody except Noah and his family is following God, believing in God, or obeying God instead. They're all doing what is right in their own eyes, and they've defiled themselves to a great extent. And one of the things that we know about God is that He's holy, and that God does not overlook sin and allow it to continue and say, well, I'm a loving and merciful God, so you can just do as you please, and you're still going to be blessed. No, there are severe, extreme, radical, total consequences for sin. And so we have then the record of the flood. And, God preserves all life on earth on the ark, but wipes out sinful humanity. And so again, Noah's descendants, they know who Yahweh, which is the personal name of God in the Old Testament. In most Bible versions, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. Noah's descendants know who Yahweh is. But by the time of the Tower of Babel, history has repeated itself, and people are intent on an evil thing. They are not worshiping Yahweh, and they are seeking to bring all of humanity together in an exaltation of humanity, building this tower and establishing a false religious system that would be universal. And this, of course, we can logically infer from the total revelation we have in the Bible that this would have been something inspired by Satan, who, the Bible says that, like in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, that when the nations of the earth worship idols, what they're really worshiping are demons. And so we know that Satan and his demons are the spiritual power behind idolatry. And that when people worship the creation, when they worship their own creations, their own mental creations, conglomerations of human qualities, animal qualities, natural qualities, whatever, what's really being worshiped there is Satan himself, and his system is being strengthened, okay? And of course he has an agenda, and that agenda is to deny God and to exalt himself. We read in 1 Timothy chapter 3 that Satan fell in the first place through pride. So he seeks his own exaltation. So at the Tower of Babel, you had the real potential of Satan having his way, that the entire human creation would be under his power in denial of God. So what happens? God intervenes and confounds their languages so that they can't understand each other. And so God takes direct action to create nations. Humanity is not one anymore. Because of the language differences, humanity goes in separate ways. So Satan cannot achieve that goal. All right? So this introduces the concept of separation, and it is an important concept because God is holy. Now, the word holy itself not only means awesomely pure, and when I teach on the attributes of God at some future point, we'll go into this in depth, what holiness is. But it also means separate. Okay, it carries a very clear meaning of separate. So God is separate from sin, from sinners. And any people that would come into a relationship with Him must likewise be separate. This is why He says, I am holy, you be holy. So God, if He's going to have a relationship with humanity at all, He needs a separated people from sin unto Himself. People who do not follow the world in all of its corruptions, but rather follow His law. And so the idea of separation, therefore, is a biblical concept. It's necessitated by the universality of sin, the reality of sin. So, this is the theological background behind why God would create a nation in a world situation that he's already established where there are multiple nations. He can thus create a nation that would be separated unto him, to whom he could reveal himself. And that's what we read about in Genesis chapter 12. This is the historical record. Now Yahweh said to Abram, "Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Okay, this is the initiation by God of a relationship with humanity that answers deism and shows that there is historical evidence that God has interacted with the world and with the human race. This is a historical event. This is the beginning of it right here. This is the beginning of Judaism. This is the beginning of God's covenant relationship with humanity. A relationship that continues into the new covenant period that we are in right now. That fulfills, this new covenant fulfills the old covenant that he established on the law, but this covenant of promise right here is something that hasn't been abrogated as the Mosaic law has. And of course that's referring to stuff that we haven't discussed yet and that I will discuss. But my point is, this is a covenant of promise, we're told in the book of Galatians. And this promise is not just for the descendants of Abraham, but all the families of the earth shall be blessed through him. So opaquely, God is already revealing that what he's doing here is not just establishing a relationship with one earthly nation, but he is establishing a relationship with humanity. And with the background that we have for the fall, it makes sense, and the Bible bears out, that this is a redemptive relationship to restore us from the effects of the fall back into a relationship with him and back into an eternal purpose. So all this is indicated by what we see here. So with that then, we can say Judaism is, in its original form, a true revelation of God. And all subsequent history bears this out. Now, I could make a huge case on this, but let's just go from here just to consider a couple more verses that pertain to Judaism. And let's move to Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 32 through 40. Deuteronomy is the 5th book in the Bible. Moses says to the people of Israel, "Indeed, ask now concerning the former days which were before you, since the day that God created man on the earth, and inquire from one end of the heaven to the other. Has anything been done like this great thing?" And of course he's talking about God's coming to them in Egypt, delivering them from Egypt, leading them through the wilderness and into the promised land. "Or has anything been heard like it?" Okay, this is making my point. My point is, what we have happening in the history of Israel is unique, unparalleled in any other religion. Has any people heard the voice of God speaking from the midst of the fire, as you have heard it, and survived? Or has a God tried to go to take for himself a nation from within another nation, by trials, by signs and wonders, and by war, and by a mighty hand, and by an outstretched arm, and by great terrors, as Yahweh your God did for you in Egypt before your eyes? To you it was shown that you might know that Yahweh, He is God, there is no other beside Him. Out of the heaven He let you hear His voice to discipline you, and on earth He let you see His great fire, and you heard His words from the midst of the fire. Because He loved your fathers, therefore He chose their descendants after them, and He personally brought you from Egypt by His great power, driving out from before you nations greater and mightier than you, to bring you in and to give you their land for an inheritance, as it is today. Know therefore and take it to your heart that Yahweh, He is God in heaven above and on earth below. There is no other. Now, I've got all of this underlined in my Bible, and you should too, because it's extremely significant. We are seeing here the open affirmation that what has happened here is unique, that it has not happened anywhere else. And what we need to point out about this, just from the standpoint of an objective search for truth, is this was not done in a corner. It's not like, I've researched cults for a living and as a full-time ministry for 3.5 decades. And there are a lot of religious traditions that make extraordinary claims, but it's always stuff that is unverifiable. In other words, it's, in all other cases besides the biblical tradition, it's stuff that's fantastic on the face of it, to the point of absurdity a lot of times. And if incredible claims are made, it's stuff that was done off in a corner somewhere in an inaccessible place. And and there's no long tradition to support it. It's completely different with the Bible here. Okay, what you have here is Egypt is not some insignificant nation. It was the mightiest nation on the earth at the time. God chose that nation to make Himself known in the midst of it, overcoming their army, not just some little Mesopotamian nation's, army, but the Egyptian army, through an abundance of plagues, signs, and wonders. And, just continually parting the Red Sea, drowning Pharaoh's men, bringing them into the wilderness, sustaining them for 40 years through manna, bread that would appear on the ground every morning, guiding them along through a cloud that would move ahead of them and they would follow it in the day, and a pillar of fire that was in the sky at night. So these people were living for 40 years with constant miracles, unprecedented in all history. Now, people will say, yeah, well, that's, I've never seen anything like that. You're expecting me to believe that? That's too big a stretch, and that seems like a reasonable response. But the fact of the matter is, if you consider this whole search that we've had and how we've looked at, we are people who are, built around the need for purpose, and there are things about our own nature in the world that would tell us that there is as we've seen in this whole class, we've already reached the conclusion, independent of a consideration of the Bible, that there must be a personal, holy, supernatural, transcendent, infinite God. So we already have logical reason to believe in such a God. We're just looking to see if he revealed himself. Now, if he did reveal himself, of course, he's not asking us to deny our logic and take it on some questionable person's testimony. He's going to give us abundant proofs so that we can logically have a firm basis to believe in him. All he's asking us to do is believe that miracles are possible. And when you consider the source, why wouldn't they be possible? You see, if God, we already saw just logical evaluation through when we were looking at naturalism and atheism and so forth, materialism, there has to be a supernatural, infinite, all-powerful source to this universe. Now, if that's what God is, if God is all-powerful, if he could, and the Bible reveals that he did, merely speak, and the whole universe leaps into existence, then why is it such a great thing to believe that he could part the Red Sea? If he can create out of nothing the entire universe, why is it such a great thing to believe that he can create a plague of frogs for Pharaoh? Or whatever is recorded in there. It's not fantastic, it's logical. In fact, our search for truth would lead us to expect. We've already come to the expectation that there should have been some revelation. And if there is revelation, it's going to be unique and it's going to be powerful, because this is the God of the universe revealing himself. And that is, my friends, exactly what we find in the biblical record. God has revealed himself. He's revealed himself in an abundant, miraculous way to give us abundant proof and basis for our faith. And here's the thing. You can't explain history without reference to miracles. You can't explain what's going on in the world today without reference to miracles. Israel's history is a miracle. This is how the nation started. They were slaves in Egypt. They were a people, but they were not an independent nation on earth. They were slaves to Pharaoh. And the only reason that they ceased being slaves to Pharaoh was that God intervened. He pursued Moses to the desert, said, "Take your shoes off from your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground." And says, "Go to Pharaoh and tell him to let my people go." And everything else ensued from that. It was God who started this nation. And so, and brought them into the land, and they marched around the walls of Jericho for 7 days, one time each day until the seventh day. Then the seventh day, they marched around it 7 times, and then the priests blew their ram's horns, and the walls came tumbling down. That's how they conquered the first people in that land, after crossing miraculously the Jordan River. The Jordan River held back for them so that they could cross it on dry land. All of this is miracle. So history itself has miracles in it. And the only reason why someone would seek an alternative explanation for how all these things happen is that they're presupposing that miracles aren't possible. But as we've seen logically, that is scientism, that is naturalism. It's a philosophical position, it's not a scientific position to say miracles are not possible. That is based on a philosophical preference that can't be demonstrated from science. A seeker of truth who's really looking for whether there is any revelation of God is going to have to examine the record of history to see if there are any credible instances of miracles. And when you do, this is what you find. And so once you acknowledge the possibility of miracles, there's no reason not to accept the testimony here that these were miracles. Why doesn't this stuff happen all the time? Because this is a unique revelation of God. So unique events happen to corroborate it. If it was common, it wouldn't be significant. God is corroborating the fact that he's revealing himself through unusual events called miracles that can only have a supernatural explanation. Okay, so then the final verse that I want to look at for Judaism is chapter 7, verses 6 through 8, just a few chapters later. For you are a holy people to Yahweh your God. Yahweh your God has chosen you to be a people for his own possession out of all the people who are on the face of the earth. Yahweh did not set his love on you, nor choose you, because you were more in number than any of the people, for you were the lowest of all peoples, but because Yahweh loved you and kept the oath which he swore to your forefathers, Yahweh brought you out by a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the land of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So what we see here is just the fact that God chose a people who were small in number. He chose a people who did not have the sophisticated culture and civilization to produce a religion as significant as Judaism has been. And he did so for the very purpose that it would be all the more obvious that this is a revelation and intervention of God. Now, we're in a unique position in this class to appreciate something that I think is very important. We have done a methodical examination of worldviews, and we've seen that Theism is the only worldview that is coherent, and it answers all kinds of needs that other worldviews don't. We need God to be infinite, but we also need him to be personal. We need him to be supernatural. We need him to be transcendent. We need him to be holy, moral. This is the God that you find in the Bible, okay? It is a more satisfying explanation of reality than anything that all the Greek philosophers came up with. They could never put these things together. Some of them would posit that God was infinite. Some of them would posit that he was personal, but they never put it together. It was beyond the best human minds to come up with this concept. Yet that was, as we've seen in this class, that's exactly what we need to have a coherent worldview that we can live by 24/7 and not have to live some of the time as if something else is true. So let me point out to you that this concept does exist in theism. Theism originated with Judaism, and within the Old Testament, what you find then is that this concept didn't come from a people who had great learning and great abilities to construct something like this. It came by revelation. This is the God who made himself known. So again, another support that this revelation is authentic is profundity. It answers the questions, it solves our problems, but it wasn't something we created. It's something God gave the human race. It's something God made known. And he confirmed that by picking an insignificant people who were migrants. They were people who wandered about, nomads, shepherds. They didn't have the sophistication to create this. So this is a revelation from God. And the final thing I want to point out to you out of that passage, shouldn't have shut my Bible so soon, in Deuteronomy, actually back in Deuteronomy 4, 32 through 40. Is twice God says, to you it was shown that you might know that Yahweh, he is God, there is no other beside him, in verse 35, and then again in verse 39, know therefore today and take it to your heart that Yahweh, he is God in heaven above and on the earth below. There is no other. So contrary to what liberal Bible scholars who teach that the Bible was written, that this great monotheism, because a lot of scholars will acknowledge this monotheism is a sophisticated theology, but they will try to say it happened through an evolutionary process over many centuries, and it wasn't until about the 6th century BC with Isaiah in the 8th century and Jeremiah in the 6th and so forth that you get this lofty monotheism. And so people try to explain this profound worldview through an evolutionary process. However, we just saw right here, this was never a tribal deity, never just one of many gods, the God of the Hebrews. He came and established a relationship with them, and as we're going to see, it was for a purpose of redeeming the entire human race. He needed a relationship with one nation to whom he could teach his laws, his ways, prophesy a coming Messiah, and show people that they can't that they are sinners, they can't keep the law, they do need to be delivered, they need a deliverer, and then ultimately come in the person of Jesus Christ. But all of that was with a view ultimately to reaching the whole human race through the preaching of the gospel to the ends of the earth, so that all people might have an opportunity to be saved. Okay, so that being the case, this is not a tribal deity. This is the universal ultimate God. And that point is made right from the beginning here by Moses, that he is the only God. All the other gods are false. So this, people will take, like it says God's a jealous God. Well, that means these other gods exist. No, if your wife was completely devoted to an imaginary man, you don't think that you would feel jealous even though the other person didn't exist. It's a matter of reacting to the intentions of our heart, our unfaithful heart, whether or not the other gods exist. So next week we've established that Judaism is valid, but what we're going to look at now is, what about Christianity? Is Christianity valid, and what about Islam? It makes a further claim. And where does Christianity put, if Christianity is valid, where does that put Judaism? So these are the kinds of questions that we still need to address. Any questions at this point? Jim?
So you could actually say, maybe this is oversimplifying, that Judaism is a truth, but it's incomplete.
Well, that's exactly what I'm going to say. Those are my very words I'm going to be using. Yes. Judaism is valid, but incomplete. In fact, just to let the cat out of the bag, I hope you'll still come back next week. But what I'm going to be saying next week is, Judaism is valid but incomplete. It is fulfilled and completed by Christianity. So then what about Islam? Does Islam then come and add something that completes Christianity? No. Islam simply contradicts Christianity and tries to reconstruct something similar to Judaism, which is not valid. So that's what we're going to see, but we'll go through it step by step.